Well, guys, I ran into my first major problem. After my last video, after test driving and getting home, I let the car sit overnight, and I woke up to this glorious, massive puddle under the car that I got covered in cat litter, and it ended up being gear oil. So I got under the car and I got to looking, and it was coming out of this seal here on the passenger side. So the first thing I did was I pulled the axle out and I popped the seal out, and if you can see here, this was brand new seal that I put in there. The dust side of the seal was split, and but looking at the back side, and I checked all this out, it looked okay. I wiggled the axle, and the axle had a lot of play in it. So this has a limited slip differential in it. OBX, I think, was the name brand of it. It's not the Queef. But I tried to adjust the end play. If you can see in here, my shims I put in here were a little tattered. I tried to cut them because the shims I bought, the opening of them wasn't as big. So I tried cutting this one, and then I ended up kind of boogering it up, and but it was the only one in the kit that was the size I needed, so I stuck it in there anyways because the axle wasn't going to touch it. But that's neither here nor there. I don't think that's my issue. When I drained the oil out of this thing, it looked like it had a nice pearl additive to it, like you would put into an automotive paint. That's how much fine metal was in the oil. So I stuck a pry bar in here and started moving it around. Let's see if I can get it back in here so you guys can see that. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but it does have play in the end of it. So that means I get to pull the transmission back out of this thing. I got to looking online and saw a pretty handy dandy trick to use some pieces of solder to adjust the end play of that bearing, but I need to pull this thing out. I'll kind of show the process of how to get this thing out of here without taking apart a whole lot of stuff on the car. But I got to get this thing out of here and get it pulled apart just to make sure everything on the inside of it's okay, because the last thing I need is a damaged transmission. So I'll bring you guys back as I start pulling this thing out. Alright guys, here we are underneath the car. It is 6 in the morning. My wife had to leave for work. A lot of other things I would rather be doing right now than trying to pull this transmission out, but my goal is, she's only going to be gone like 5 or 6 hours, is I'm going to try to get this whole transmission pulled out, opened up, try to fix what's wrong with it, and then get it back in the car. So I'm going to try and undo as little as possible under here. Like, I'm going to pull the starter out, just slide it back here and lay it on the header. And I got these 4 14mm bolts here. I got to take this lower brace off. It's all 14s back underneath here and a couple 14s up here. Drop this dude out. And then we're going to move up top. But since it's so early in the morning, I'm not trying to make a whole lot of noise. So I'm trying to do this all by hand without using my impact. I'll give the neighbors some peace and quiet till about 8 o'clock. So let me drop this off, and I'll bring you back. Alright, I got everything done underneath. There's a 17mm bolt there. As I mentioned, I got the 2 14s there, 2 14s there. I got the starter pulled out and zip tied up. It's going to rest on that little metal plate right there. So I think for the most part I got everything under here done. I'm hoping I do not have to take that half shaft out, because that means I'll have to pull the axle on the driver's side, and I don't want to do that if I don't have to. sure it's going to bite me when I go to put this thing back in. But again, I'm just trying to do as little as possible to get this thing out as quick as I can. So here we are on the top end. I've already took the cold air intake off, and my intercooler pipe here. So the hope is here is that I can just take out the 3 bolts on this motor mount. I'm gonna try to leave I'm gonna leave the motor mount in, undo it off this bracket, and then try to bend it up. Disconnect my shifter cables. The hardest part, I think, for this thing is going to be getting down in here. You probably can't even see it, but there's 2 bolts on the slave cylinder, and then there's a couple bolts down here holding the, I guess it's like a distribution block down here. That may be a bit of a challenge. I really don't want to take my oil separator out, just because of the way I put this thing in. It kind of in a bad way if I had to take that thing out and try to put it back in, but I may have to get to all of the bolts. There's probably one of the harder bolts to get to, especially since the header's in the car, there is a bolt down in here that you have to come in through that hole on the motor mount and then go through. So I have to get fancy with some extensions. Well, I got it out, but I can tell you now, I'm going to have to pull that half shaft out, which I did not want to do. I didn't want to take that other axle out, but it's just going to be way too challenging. As you can see, there's a whole lot of stuff left on this car. I got it out in 1 hour and 2 minutes. But there is no way, if this was a stock car, could I have done it that fast. And the reason being is because I've had this thing apart. All the nuts and bolts came out pretty easy. Since this isn't an all stock, I was able to get to some things that you probably couldn't get to. Like, you'd probably have to take your battery tray out and all that to get this thing out. So it's going to be fun trying to get it back in. But here's the transmission on the ground. I'm going to get some plastic down and flip her up on her end and start tearing her apart. Yeah, now that this thing is out, maybe you can see a little bit. Maybe not. It's hard to tell. I don't know if you can see that wiggling. But she's loose. So now I got to take all these 12s out. There's some gears here. And then all of these 14s around. Take out my reverse. And then there's, to make it easier, there's all of these will come out, and there's some springs and some balls in there that allow the shaft in there to move around. Get started on this, and then I'll show you what it looks like as I'm getting into it. Alright, I got the first outer cover off. These guys are 36 millimeters. Then you gotta knock this little retaining pin out here, and that will allow me to pull these gears off. That they have to come off so that this main case will be able to slide off. Also, as I mentioned, there was these springs and I guess the retainer balls that go inside those holes there. That just helps taking that out. And I believe I have to take this guy out here. That'll help this thing slide on and off. Alright, I got those knocked out. So the goal really on this is to try and pull this whole thing off as a together. May not necessarily be able to do that, as I didn't here, but mainly just to keep it all in wanting to keep this whole thing together so that I remember how it all goes back together. Then we got this little guy right here. May have to pry that one off, but you get the idea on this. I'm gonna go ahead and pull that gear off and get the rest of these off because I need my hands free. Well, I found my source of all the metal, so you can see in there how metallic that is. But if you look, you see this nice big gouge right there in the case. That gouge is coming from this part of my limited slip differential. So by having too much end play on, this was the bearing that had the extra end play in it. You can imagine, as this thing is riding inside there, and then all of a sudden you make a sharp turn and it's trying to lock the front end up, and it's got some wiggle to it. It's going to rub up against that case right there because it's a pretty tight fit in there. So this is the race that I need to adjust the end play on. So I'm going to have to get that out of there, take these old shims out. What you do is you put a little piece of solder here, maybe in 3 places. Put this race back in. Put the case back down there and snug it down. And then take it all back apart. Pop that race back out and then measure how thick it is. And then I believe it's either 0.5 or 0.05 millimeters what it should be. I'll have to look that up before I put some more shims back in there. But ultimately, that was my problem. I'm glad I only had about 20 miles or so on this thing, because this would have been nasty. Had that thing wore all the way through the case down there, probably would have left a man stranded. So let me start getting this thing cleaned up, and then I'll start working on getting my end plays adjusted. So I don't know if you can see this or not, but right there is the piece of solder. I went ahead and put 3 pieces in there. I put the case on here and tightened it down. You can see it's smushed a little bit. There's 0 play in this guy right now. So now I'm going to pull it apart and get some measurements on how thick it is. So here was the little pieces of solder. You can see it actually has the imprint of the bearing number on there, if it'll focus. But you measure the thickness of it. Mine ended up being 57 thousandths of an inch. The spec for end play is 20 to 40 thousandths. So with this being 57, I went for 55 thousandths to give me 20 thousandths end play, and it ended up being these 2 shims, which I find very interesting. Is this thinner shim was the factory one that I had taken out of there, and so I only needed it and this thin one to get me what I needed. The shim that I had in there was this one. Is all beat up, and now I remember why I tried to cut this thing. Is because when this race sits on that bearing and then this shim sits in there, it actually was touching the part of the tapered bearing right there. So I was trying to bend that up so it wouldn't touch it. So when I do these shims, is I'm just going to put the thicker one in on the top to give it a little bit of space. But to give you an idea of how far I was off, I was about 1.1 millimeters off, which is, for a tapered bearing with a side load, is a bunch. So I always say you can do just about anything with time, money, and not having the fear of failing. So I didn't really know what I was doing here on this end play. But I can tell you it's cost me a lot of time because of my failure. But thankfully, I think I caught it early enough that I already had the shims. I just had to buy some new seals for the axle. So I'm going to start, I guess I got brake cleaner. I'm going to clean all this up, clean all these bearings off. Thankfully, it's just aluminum in there and it's not steel. That's floating around inside there. I get it all cleaned up, get these new shims in, and slap her back together. Alright, so it is done and back together. Time for the painstaking process of getting that back in there. And just like that, it is done and back in the car. I'm about done working on this one today. Gonna go over and start working on that one for a few, probably 6.5 hours total. Pull the transmission, pull it apart, adjust the end play, and put it back in. At some point, you probably seen that earlier in the videos, I got some spot fill in some places on here where I had the runs. Put a little bit of that on there, and then you can sand it down and get the run out without sanding all the way through the clear. So that's next step on this one, and plus driving it and getting some hours in the seat. Hope everybody has a great day. Talk to you later.